Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening, as the shadows lengthen and the moon begins its silent, measured climb across the velvet sky? Tonight, let us travel far back in the winding path of time, to a place where the human desire for knowledge found its grandest, most ambitious expression. A monumental testament built not of granite or bronze, but woven from papyrus and ink. The sacred enclosure known simply as the Great Library of Alexandria, the bright heart of a city washed by the Mediterranean tides. This was a city born of a conqueror's vision, rising like a pearl from the delta's edge, designed to be the nexus of the known world. And within its walls, the Ptolemaic rulers sought to gather every written word, every calculation, every prayer, and every recorded history that humanity had ever dared to pen, making it a treasury unlike any other that has since graced the earth. The story begins in the wake of Alexander's meteoric passage, when Ptolemy Soter, the first of his dynasty, understood that true enduring power lay not merely in armies and fleets, but in the possession and mastery of profound wisdom. He decreed the creation of the Mouseion, the seat of the Muses, a sanctuary dedicated to study, meditation, and inquiry, resembling not a dusty repository but a vibrant university, where the brightest minds of Greece, Egypt, and beyond were invited to live, debate, and share their sacred stipend. Imagine the cool marble halls, the gentle lapping of the great harbor just outside, and within, the low, steady murmur of scholars translating Babylonian astronomical charts, comparing Roman law codes, and arguing the geometric principles that govern the cosmos. The library itself was the vast breathing lung of the Mouseion, a colossal effort of acquisition that spanned generations, driven by an almost obsessive zeal to achieve totality. Royal agents were dispatched across the sea lanes, instructed to purchase every book and scroll they could find, paying exorbitant sums for rare philosophical treatises, ancient mythological epics, and even humble manuals on agriculture or medicine, recognizing that all human endeavor held value. It is famously recounted that every ship docking in the massive Alexandrian harbor was searched not for contraband, but for texts. If a scroll was found, it was immediately copied with meticulous care by the library's dedicated scribes, and the original was often retained by the library while the copy was reluctantly returned to the ship's owner, a powerful statement of the sovereignty of the written word. Within its walls, the sheer physical quantity of knowledge was staggering, stretching into the hundreds of thousands of individual rolls, each carefully tagged with a small clay cylinder identifying its contents and placed upon shelves of cedar or cypress. Think of the scribe Callimachus, tasked with the near-impossible labor of imposing order upon this flood tide of accumulated wisdom, composing the Pentateuch, the first true catalog of human literature, stretching over 120 books itself, classifying authors by subject and genre, and recording the first lines of their works to ensure accurate identification. This was not mere storage, but the rigorous organization of civilization's memory, turning chaos into a navigable cosmos of thought. It was here, amidst the silent weight of these countless scrolls, that Eratosthenes, the chief librarian, standing in the bright Alexandrian sunlight, utilized geometry and the shadow of a stick to calculate the circumference of the Earth with astounding accuracy, proving definitively that the world was a sphere turning in the endless void, and mapping it with lines of latitude and longitude that we still use today. Imagine the revelation that must have passed through the halls when men realized that the very size of their physical home, their planet, could be measured and understood through pure thought and patient observation, a testament to the power nurtured within those hallowed rooms. The library housed the complete works of the tragedians of Athens, the sweeping histories of Herodotus, the intricate medical observations of Hippocrates, and the foundational mathematics of Euclid, who taught his craft right there in Alexandria's intellectual climate. The scholars who inhabited this space were not just readers. They were custodians of time itself, responsible for standardizing Greek texts, establishing the authoritative versions of Homer, ensuring that the poetry and philosophy conceived centuries earlier in distant lands would not decay into corrupted fragments or be lost entirely to the silence of history. However, such a vast reservoir of power and knowledge naturally drew the gaze of ambition and the shadow of destruction, for great brilliance casts an equally great shadow, and fragility is often the companion of vastness. The library was not truly destroyed in a single dramatic conflagration, as some later legends would misleadingly suggest, but suffered a slow, agonizing attrition, a gradual decay of patronage, political neglect, and specific acts of damage over centuries that chipped away at its completeness. The first significant wound is sometimes traced to the skirmishes during Julius Caesar's siege of the city, when military necessity caused a great number of scrolls housed near the harbor to be incinerated, a searing loss that signaled the vulnerability of paper to the passions of iron and fire. The spirit of dedicated scholarship began to wane as the Ptolemaic dynasty grew decadent and the political center of gravity shifted inexorably toward Rome. Successive emperors and local rulers, lacking the fierce intellectual curiosity of the early founders, failed to replenish the stock of texts lost to humidity, insect damage, and the simple wearing of time, viewing the immense collection less as a living treasury and more as a burdensome monument of the past. The scholars themselves, the lifeblood of the Mausean, found their stipends cut and their focus diverted by the increasing demands of a turbulent and fractured world, their serene debates slowly replaced by the clamor of civil strife and religious intolerance. Yet for hundreds of years, the structure endured, a pale, venerable ghost of its former glory, still housing irreplaceable texts and attracting dedicated minds when the outside world allowed for peace. It stood as a silent rebuke to the fleeting nature of political power, its mere existence proclaiming that ideas, once penned, possessed a durability that transcended the lifespan of kings and the boundaries of empires. The weight of all human endeavor rested on those parchment sheets, the accumulated striving of millennia stored in one massive single location, making it perhaps too great a temptation for those who sought to remake the world in their own image. We must understand that when we mourn the Library of Alexandria, we are mourning not merely a building, but the irreplaceable loss of connecting threads, the gaps in the tapestry of history that can never mended. How many lost Greek plays, how many detailed accounts of ancient African kingdoms, how many philosophical inquiries into the nature of existence were housed solely within those walls, texts that vanished from the face of the earth and took with them the memories of entire civilizations. The loss was exponential, multiplying the silence, plunging us into greater darkness regarding the true scope of ancient thought and achievement, forever haunting the edges of our understanding. Even today, the pursuit of knowledge echoes the deep, foundational commitment established in that Egyptian city so long ago, a commitment that demands not just acquisition, but relentless preservation and thoughtful dissemination. The enduring lesson of Alexandria is that knowledge is a sacred trust, perpetually vulnerable, and that the construction of a great library is an act of profound and selfless hope against the inevitable ravages of time, striving to hold back the tide of forgetting with ink and dedicated purpose. The great structure itself, known as the Mauseum, the dwelling place of the Muses, was not merely a repository of scrolls. It was a sprawling academy, a silent city dedicated entirely to the preservation and expansion of human thought. Within its cool, shaded colonnades, far from the clamor of the busy Egyptian port, men walked with measured steps, their sandals whispering against the polished marble floors, fully aware they trod upon ground consecrated by the deepest form of human yearning. This sacred quietude was maintained rigorously, allowing the focused energy of countless scribes and philosophers to converge upon the delicate tasks of translation, commentary, and categorization, forging an almost monastic devotion to the written word that few institutions before or since have matched. The light filtering in from the high windows seemed to illuminate the dust motes dancing over the written word, giving the entire atmosphere a shimmering, almost celestial quality, appropriate for a place where mortals attempted to grasp the eternal. It was here that the brilliant poet and scholar Callimachus undertook the monumental labor of creating the Pinakes, the vast, detailed catalog that ordered the staggering collection by subject, author, and genre. This was not a simple listing, but a profound philosophical mapping of the known intellectual universe, providing short biographies of the authors and the opening lines of their works, transforming a mere heap of documents into a navigable landscape of learning. His tireless effort provided the key to unlocking the library's true potential, ensuring that the wisdom accumulated over centuries could be accessed efficiently and understood relationally, proving that the organization of knowledge is often as crucial as its initial collection. Without this foundational structure, the 200,000, then 400,000, and finally nearly 700,000 scrolls would have remained an impenetrable thicket, useful only to those few blessed with endless patience and perfect memory. Without this foundational structure, the 200,000, then 400,000, and finally nearly 700,000 scrolls would have remained an impenetrable thicket, useful only to those few blessed with endless patience and perfect memory. The Ptolemies ensured their library's supremacy not through passive acceptance, but through active, almost militant acquisition, sending out dedicated agents, often called book hunters, to scour the civilized world for rare, lost, or superior editions of every significant text. Any ship docking in the massive harbor of Alexandria was subject to scrutiny, its passengers required by royal decree to surrender any scroll found aboard for immediate copying by the library's expert scribes, sometimes receiving only the copy back while the original was retained for the royal collection. This audacious policy, though sometimes viewed as intellectual piracy by rival kingdoms, was driven by an unyielding desire for the authoritative, uncorrupted text, ensuring that the Alexandrian version became the scholarly standard against which all other copies were measured. These master copies, often bearing the royal seal and the meticulous annotations of the chief librarians, were treated with the reverence afforded to sacred relics, stored in specialized rooms where temperature and humidity were carefully regulated by clever engineering and devoted staff. The chief librarians, such as Zenodotus of Ephesus, were tasked not only with housing the texts, but with purging them of centuries of scribal errors, interpolations, and poorly remembered editions, establishing definitive, clean editions of foundational works like the Homeric epics. This rigorous work of textual criticism, involving the comparison of multiple conflicting manuscripts line by line, demanded immense philological skill and an unwavering dedication to historical accuracy, setting the standard for scholarly editing for 2,000 years hence. They labored to restore the authentic voices of the ancient masters, marking suspect lines with small, precise symbols, the obulus or the critical asterisk, signifying doubt or spuriousness, thus cleansing the sacred spring of literature for subsequent generations who relied upon their judgment. The very concept of a literary canon, a defined body of essential literature, was solidified within these halls, determining which voices would echo through history and which would tragically fade into obscurity. The very concept of a literary canon, a defined body of essential literature, was solidified within these halls, determining which voices would echo through history and which would tragically fade into obscurity. One cannot speak of the library's glory without honoring Eratosthenes, a man whose mind encompassed mathematics, geography, poetry, and history, holding the esteemed title of fourth chief librarian with great distinction. It was Eratosthenes who used the library's vast resources, specifically the records detailing shadow lengths observed simultaneously in the deep southern city of Syene and in Alexandria, to calculate the circumference of the Earth with startling accuracy, demonstrating the globe's true size long before the Common Era. This breathtaking intellectual leap, based on pure reason and methodical observation drawn from comprehensive data stored within the collection, stands as a profound testament to the library's function as a laboratory for the cosmos, proving that the pursuit of texts was inextricably linked to the mapping of the physical world. He was the epitome of the polymath, the true scholar who refused the limitations of singular specialization, embracing all facets of inquiry under the guiding light of the muse's singular inspiration. Day after day, hundreds of professional scribes sat hunched over low tables in the scriptorium, their hands stained with soot-based ink, working diligently to replicate the fragile papyrus scrolls onto new, fresh sheets, ensuring the continuance of the texts for future study. The sheer physical commitment required to manage the inventory and sustain the flow of new copies demanded an enormous economic infrastructure, drawing upon the vast wealth of the Ptolemaic kings to pay for the expensive materials, the finest Nile papyrus, and the meticulously prepared skins for vellum or parchment. The rustle of newly cut reeds, the soft scraping of the pen nibs across the fibers, and the pervasive scent of papyrus and cedar oil permeated the air, forming the quiet soundtrack of preservation, a constant, measured defiance against the inevitable decay inherent in organic materials. These were the anonymous guardians, the silent warriors who fought against oblivion, one careful, copied letter at a time, their personal histories largely lost, but their collective work echoing powerfully through the subsequent ages. Beyond literature and mathematics, the library fostered revolutionary advances in anatomical study and medicine, drawing upon ancient Egyptian knowledge and blending it seamlessly with Greek Hippocratic theory regarding the humors and the body's workings. Scholars here meticulously studied the human body, conducting unprecedented investigations into the structure of organs and the flow of vital energies, laying groundwork that would be lost and then tragically rediscovered centuries later by others working in darkness. The collection housed rare medical texts detailing sophisticated treatments and surgical procedures previously unknown to the Hellenic world, creating a nexus of healing knowledge that attracted the most respected physicians from across the Mediterranean basin, transforming Alexandria into the capital city of ancient scientific practice. This integrated approach, where philosophy informed physics and where medicine utilized geography and astronomical observation, illustrated the holistic view of knowledge held by the Mausian, that all fields were merely different paths leading to the singular summit of comprehensive truth. Yet this magnificent edifice, built upon the foundation of royal patronage, also contained within its very structure the seeds of its own eventual sorrow, as its fortunes were inextricably tied to the volatile lineage of the Ptolemies themselves. When the royal house was stable and generous, the library flourished, its coffers filled and its acquisition policies aggressive. But when internal strife gripped the throne, the commitment wavered, and the scholars often found themselves caught tragically between competing political factions and royal jealousies. The library was not only a collection of scrolls, but a profound symbol of Egyptian power and Greek cultural dominance, making it an inevitable target in the political struggles for influence both within the city and from the rising power of Rome across the sea. The scholars, initially shielded by their perceived neutrality in the face of power, slowly realized that the purity of intellectual endeavor offered no genuine armor against the sharp edges of imperial ambition and unavoidable political bloodshed. One of the most damaging blows, preceding the great physical losses, was the intellectual diaspora initiated by Ptolemy VIII Physcon around the year 145 BC. a ruler whose disdain for intellectual independence and reliance on his own crude judgments led him to purge Alexandria of its finest minds. Scholars, critics, and philosophers who had been nurtured by the Museum were abruptly scattered across the Hellenic world, carrying with them fragments of Alexandrian wisdom and establishing new centers of learning in places like Rhodes, Athens, and the court of Pergamon. Though this expulsion inadvertently disseminated Alexandrian methods throughout the Mediterranean, it drained the heartblood from the library itself, breaking the chain of continuous, cooperative genius and signaling that political tyranny could prioritize petty grievances over the invaluable resource of human intellect. The library, though physically intact for the moment, suffered an irreversible injury to its living spirit, diminished profoundly by the absence of the great thinkers who alone held the keys to truly interpret and expand its vast, silent holdings. As Rome began its inexorable ascendancy, extending its iron reach across the Mediterranean, the strategic importance of Alexandria grew immensely, placing the city, and consequently its priceless collection, directly in the path of world-changing conflict and imperial maneuvering. The careful, measured rhythms of the scholarly life were increasingly disturbed by the tramp of legionary feet and the shouted demands of Roman proconsuls, who saw the library not as a sacred institution, but as a magnificent spoil of war or a political bargaining chip to be used against local rulers. The air of quiet contemplation that had defined the Mausian for centuries began to be replaced by the palpable tension of deep uncertainty, the scholars feeling the chilling, fragile nature of their protection beneath the looming shadow of the Western Empire's absolute power. The fate of millennia of stored wisdom now rested precariously upon the whims and logistical decisions of generals consumed by ambition and the immediate necessity of brutal battle maneuvers. It was during the critical struggle in 48 BC between Julius Caesar and the forces supporting the young Ptolemaic throne that the scholarly sanctuary was directly threatened, pulled unwillingly into the vortex of a foreign civil war fought upon the very edges of Egyptian soil. Caesar, besieged in the royal quarter near the harbor by hostile forces, found himself in a desperate tactical situation, compelled by military necessity to secure his small fleet and prevent it from falling into the hands of the opposing Egyptian admirals. The decision was swift, brutal, and made without consideration for the delicate treasures held nearby. He ordered the burning of the ships moored in the Great Harbor Basin, intending to create a defensive barrier of fire and smoke to protect his own exposed position from immediate attack. The flames, once unleashed, found greedy fuel in the wooden docks, the massive stores of grain reserved for the city, and the nearby arsenals, spreading quickly and uncontrollably through the tightly packed royal quarter, driven by the strong, unforgiving Mediterranean wind. Though the main building of the Mausian was set further back from the immediate waterfront, the adjacent storage facilities and annexes, believed to house thousands upon thousands of valuable scrolls awaiting cataloging or shipment, were catastrophically consumed by the hungry inferno. Imagine the horrifying spectacle. The intense, searing heat buckling the heavy stone of the storage rooms, the great roar of the conflagration deafening the panicked cries of the citizens, and the thick, black smoke carrying aloft the ashes of untold histories and poems that had survived previous ages of turmoil. Witnesses later recounted the sickening, unmistakable scent of burning parchment, a smell like dried leaves and bitter spices, that permeated the entire city for days, a funereal odor signifying the rapid, agonizing end of perhaps 40,000 or more priceless volumes. This sudden, violent loss represented the first great physical scar upon the face of the library, a scar inflicted not by intellectual disdain, but by the reckless indifference of military pragmatism and the unavoidable collateral damage of a powerful man's struggle. The official Roman account subsequently minimized the tragedy, viewing the loss of scrolls as a mere operational casualty, far less significant than the strategic gain achieved by the maneuver that saved Caesar's beleaguered forces from annihilation. For the remaining scholars, however, the devastation was a profound, soul-shattering trauma, the equivalent of watching their entire ancestral memory turn instantaneously to smoke and dust, revealing the terrifying fragility of their carefully constructed world of learning. They gathered desperately among the smoldering ruins, sifting through the charred remnants, attempting to salvage any fragment of text, finding only brittle edges and illegible carbonized rolls, silent testaments to the swift and unforgiving power of elemental destruction when combined tragically with human conflict. The destruction of this sizable portion of the library demonstrated clearly to the world that the preservation of culture was now utterly secondary to the immediate demands of imperial warfare, setting a chilling and terrible precedent for the centuries of strife that were soon to follow. In the years immediately following the conflict, Cleopatra, keen to maintain the intellectual prestige of her city and soothe the deeply outraged scholarly community, made concerted efforts toward restoration of the collection. Her formidable political acumen led her to seek compensation directly from Rome, resulting in the famous presentation of 200,000 scrolls from the Library of Pergamon, a collection gifted by Mark Antony as a gesture of both diplomatic alliance and cultural repair. While this massive infusion of texts temporarily refilled the physical space and offered a wealth of new material for study, it could never truly replace the unique, critical editions that had been incinerated. The specific commentaries, the definitive Homeric texts, and the irreplaceable Alexandrian master copies meticulously compiled over generations. The replacement was a magnificent offering, yet it served as a stark reminder that true knowledge, once lost in its original context and critical form, can only ever be substituted, never perfectly restored to its initial state of grace and authority. Thus, the library, scarred but surviving, entered the late stages of its life under the increasingly severe oversight of Roman prefects and emperors, its intellectual independence slowly being eroded by the demands of a new, centralized imperial power far removed from the patronage of the Ptolemies. The funding for ambitious acquisition waned, the freedom of inquiry that had defined the Mausean diminished, and the vibrant scholarly community began to fracture, dispersing the last great generation of comprehensive Greek thinkers. The relentless curiosity that had once compelled the kings to capture every single piece of writing in the known world gave way to a more pragmatic and selective focus, concerned primarily with maintaining the prestige of the Roman Empire rather than the universal pursuit of pure truth. The slow poison of diminishing returns and intellectual stagnation began to seep into the foundations of the magnificent sanctuary, leading to a long, drawn-out decline more insidious than any sudden conflagration. The vast accumulated weight of scrolls, once the pride of the world, gradually became a physical challenge, demanding constant restoration and meticulous transcription by scribes whose passion often paled beside the original zealots who founded the great scriptorium. These silent thousands of papyri, brittle and frail, required steady humidity and careful turning, a monumental labor that stretched the diminished resources of the Roman prefects who saw the library merely as a civic fixture, a token of historic prestige rather than a spiritual hearth demanding constant renewal. The great scholarly debates ceased to rage within the echoing halls of the Mausean, replaced instead by the tedious, repetitive work of preservation, lest the sheer accumulation of age and neglect turn wisdom to dust and render the most precious texts illegible. Roman patronage, while present and necessary for the institution's sheer survival, favored practical jurisprudence, engineering manuals, and histories that glorified the triumphs of the eternal city, viewing abstract Greek metaphysics and esoteric mathematical calculations with a degree of dismissive suspicion. The emperors were fundamentally concerned with conquest, taxation, and governance, finding little immediate utility in the exhaustive linguistic analysis or the complex astronomical observations that once consumed the most brilliant Alexandrian minds. Thus, the new acquisitions were limited and focused, prioritizing bulk official documentation over intellectual rarity, often duplicating common texts already held, and ultimately failing to capture the pioneering, audacious thought that continued to flourish elsewhere in the fragmented Mediterranean world. As the centuries unfolded, a new intellectual force began to assert its profound dominance within Alexandria. The focused zeal of early Christian theology, challenging the foundational Hellenic assumptions upon which the library was meticulously built. Where the old scholars sought patiently to reconcile every contradictory philosophical school through subtle synthesis and rigorous critique, the new thinkers demanded clarity, singularity of truth, and an absolute rejection of the polytheistic, competing narratives enshrined within the library's silent shelves. This theological shift created an inherent and irreconcilable tension, for the Mouseion remained deeply devoted to its traditional gods of learning, Apollo, the Muses, and the great Hermes, and instinctively resisted the growing demands to categorize all knowledge under a single, divine, unchallengeable framework. The greatest minds of the classical tradition, sensing the approaching chill of dogmatic limitation and intellectual constriction, began one by one to drift away from the stagnant waters of the Alexandrian institution, seeking homes in burgeoning centers like Constantinople, Antioch, or Athens, where intellectual fire still burned with a protective Hellenic fervor. The esteemed chairs of the Mouseion, once filled by towering intellectual giants who commanded the knowledge of the entire known world, were increasingly occupied by well-meaning but lesser scholars, content to write meticulous glosses upon the monumental works of their predecessors rather than risk the perilous path of genuine innovation. The living, breathing heart of the library, the community of vibrant debate and audacious discovery, suffered a slow, quiet, spiritual death, leaving behind only the magnificent, echoing, silent shell built by the generous hands of the Ptolemies. Meanwhile, the very city of Alexandria, perpetually plagued by internal civic unrest, vast economic fluctuation, and the constant threat of distant imperial mismanagement, offered less and less stable ground for the maintenance of such a delicate and profoundly non-essential scholarly endeavor. Fires, riots, and the violent demands of military campaigns frequently swept through the Brutian quarter and the area surrounding the royal complex, sometimes narrowly missing the main sanctuary, but instilling a perpetual, paralyzing fear that the next wave of local violence would finish what insidious neglect had already commenced. The magnificent porticos and the once gilded lecture halls, which had once gleamed brightly white in the relentless Mediterranean sun, showed accelerating signs of structural wear, their marble floors cracked and pitted by the constant, unforgiving footsteps of time and careless, indifferent maintenance. The distant pronouncements issuing from the imperial courts of Rome, and then from the majestic new capital of Constantinople, grew increasingly hostile toward the old ways and the traditional pagan faiths that underpinned the classical corpus, culminating in severe imperial decrees that sought to utterly extinguish the public practice and enduring symbols of the ancient beliefs. These widespread edicts created an atmosphere of deep and abiding suspicion surrounding any public institution still dedicated to Hellenic learning and polytheistic study, placing the scholars of the Mouseion under constant, uncomfortable scrutiny by the rising ecclesiastical authorities of the city. The library, with its hundreds of statues of the Hellenic gods and its scrolls dedicated to forbidden rites, astrology, and philosophical skepticism, became a dangerous repository, a massive, silent monument to intellectual defiance in a world turning rapidly and forcefully towards monotheism. The sustained tension and mounting societal pressure finally broke with explosive violence when the zealous patriarch Theophilus of Alexandria moved with calculated determination against the magnificent Temple of Serapis, the grand citadel that housed the library's vital annex collection of specialized scrolls. Under the convenient guise of enforcing the recent imperial ban on all forms of pagan idolatry, a massive, frenzied mob descended upon the high sanctuary, not merely dismantling the enormous cult statues, but systematically and passionately burning the thousands of texts stored within those sacred walls, viewing them as instruments of sorcery, demonic influence, and dangerous anti-Christian knowledge. This calamity, a tragedy of unparalleled historical dimension, though it did not ultimately touch the main scholarly complex building in the Bruchion Quarter, represented a catastrophic and utterly irreplaceable loss of thousands of volumes, including specialized scientific works and duplicates intended for public access, marking the true, painful spiritual end of Alexandria's claim to universal, encompassing scholarship. Following this devastating and frightening assault, the few surviving scholars and scribes of the library retreated further into complete silence, locking away their most precious remaining treasures and ceasing all ambitious public scholarship, preferring the immediate safety of anonymity to the inevitable, violent perils of public intellectual exhibition. The very act of copying or reading texts that offered alternative, non-scriptural explanations of the cosmos and the human condition became an act of profound potential sedition against the ruling powers, forcing philosophy and advanced science to hide in the darkened corners of private residences, aristocratic villas, and isolated monastic cells. The great and comprehensive light of inquiry that had illuminated the intellectual world for 6 centuries began thus to flicker faintly behind bolted doors, struggling mightily merely to survive the rising, forceful winds of certainty, dogmatic faith, and overwhelming civic hostility. The imperial support, now barely a trickle, was directed primarily toward the preservation of ancient histories and medical texts deemed useful for the maintenance of the state and its military apparatus, leaving the complex fields of pure mathematics, theoretical astronomy, and lyric poetry to languish unbound and untranscribed. Scribes, once heroes of the state, now earned their living copying the accepted theological commentaries or producing authorized biographies of saints, their delicate skills turned away from the vast, sprawling pagan knowledge contained in the brittle papyri to the singular focus of the emerging Christian canon. The great ancient catalog itself, once meticulously updated and annotated by the finest minds, began to decay, its careful divisions and authoritative classifications becoming irrelevant to a world that no longer sought to organize knowledge by the authority of antiquity, but by the ultimate authority of revelation. The final physical decay of the main Mausian complex was not marked by a singular, defining inferno or an act of barbarian conquest, but by the slow, grinding erosion of state priority and the dispersal of its intellectual contents into less centralized, more secure private hands. As the Roman state itself fractured and its power in Egypt waned, the local administration could no longer afford the specialized fire wardens, the papyrologists, or the salaried philosophers who constituted the essential infrastructure of the library. The great institution, like a massive stone ship slowly sinking into the desert sand, began to shed its ballast, with scrolls either quietly stolen for resale or simply abandoned in damp corners to be consumed by silverfish and the relentless creeping mold of the Nile Delta. The library ceased to be the singular, unavoidable center of learning in the Mediterranean, becoming merely one archive among many, albeit a large and historically significant one, stripped of its unique authority and its royal mandate to gather all the writings of the world. Those scholars who remained true to the Hellenic ideal were forced to conduct their studies in secret societies, forming fragile networks across the disintegrating empire, passing fragments of the old wisdom, the geometry of Euclid, the physics of Archimedes, from master to student like precious, illegal contraband. Alexandria's genius survived, but it was no longer public, no longer celebrated in the marble halls. It had become fugitive, whispered in hidden chambers, seeking refuge from the increasingly intolerant gaze of the new, monotheistic power structure that governed the city's fate. This long, quiet twilight saw the slow transformation of the library's mission. It was no longer a place of discovery, but a vault. No longer an open invitation to all thinkers, but a hidden inheritance guarded by a cautious few who understood the value of the fading light they possessed. They spent their final years desperately trying to save the most critical volumes, prioritizing texts that explained the workings of the physical world or preserved the structure of the ancient Greek language, preparing the knowledge not for the glory of the present age, but for the distant possibility of a wiser, future generation that might once again appreciate its scope and power. They knew that their sacred duty was now one of transmission, not of innovation, acting as mere conduits between a dazzling past and an uncertain, darkened future. The Great Hall, designed for the vigorous, shouting exchange of intellectual conflict, began to echo with silence, broken only by the dry rustle of decaying papyrus or the soft footsteps of the lone custodians performing their daily, mournful duty of pest inspection and humidity regulation. The busts of the great dead, the philosophers and poets who had been given eternal residence within the sanctuary, stared blankly into the perpetual gloom, their marble eyes witnessing the slow, relentless retreat of enlightenment and the triumph of practical necessity over pure, beautiful curiosity. The golden age of the Mausian was over, leaving behind only the profound, haunting realization that the true end of a civilization's peak is often not heralded by fire, but by the silent turning away of minds towards simpler, more secure truths. The memory of the library, however, remained a towering ideal, even among those who sought to dismantle its remaining holdings, for its legendary status was inextricably woven into the very fabric of Alexandrian identity and intellectual pride. Chroniclers, both Christian and pagan, continued to write of its past magnificence, emphasizing the scale of its collection and the brilliance of its founders, creating a mythology around its scope that would eventually far outlive its physical existence. This mythology, though often exaggerated and simplified by distance, served as a ghost of intellectual hunger, a reminder to subsequent centuries of the sheer human potential for comprehensive understanding that had once been centralized in one magnificent locale. The true survival of the Mausian's contents was achieved not through the steadfastness of its physical walls, which eventually yielded to time and political strife, but through the intellectual diaspora of the scholars who had once walked its hallowed halls, clutching what they could remember. These fleeing academics, carrying not crates of scrolls but the meticulously catalogued contents of the library within their own minds, soon settled in burgeoning intellectual centers like Antioch, Caesarea, Constantinople, and even further east into the great intellectual courts of the Sassanid Empire in Persia. There, they wove the wisdom gleaned from Ptolemaic patronage into the fabric of new philosophies and theological arguments, citing the authoritative voice of Alexandria long after that voice had been physically silenced by imperial neglect or municipal indifference. Thus, the collected brilliance achieved a fragile, secondary permanence, existing perpetually in the marginalia and careful footnotes of succeeding generations, ensuring that the thought, if not the original parchment, could not be entirely extinguished by the forces that had besieged its origin. The very existence of the library as a failed project fueled subsequent efforts in other domains, for the realization that a single physical location could not hold the universe's knowledge led to a necessary distribution of focus across specialized institutions. Monastic scriptoria, newly dedicated to the preservation of sacred texts, adopted the rigorous copying methods perfected by the Alexandrian scribes, recognizing that even divine words require diligent human effort to survive the ravages of climate and time. In the Syrian cities, learned bishops applied the analytical tools of Euclid and Ptolemy to their own religious treatises, transforming the methods of Greek inquiry into instruments for defending and explicating their faith to the wider world. Alexandria, in a profound irony, became the unintended mother of a new intellectual epoch, training the hands and minds that would ultimately eclipse its own glory by spreading its methodology across new geographical and spiritual boundaries. Even as the grand secular repository faded into ruin, the city of Alexandria itself refused to relinquish its claim as a beacon of illuminated thought, though the nature of that light had fundamentally transformed. New schools arose, fueled by a fervent devotion to sacred texts, where rhetorical precision and philosophical rigor were applied primarily to the interpretation of Scripture, rather than the encompassing sweep of pagan astronomy and poetry that had once defined the Musaean. The dialectical tools forged by Aristotle and Plato were quickly sharpened and repurposed by the burgeoning theological academies, where intellectual contest still raged with fierce intensity, but the scope of permissible inquiry narrowed significantly under the weight of revealed truth. This transition marked a profound cultural migration, where the hunger for knowledge did not vanish, but rather found a new, singular, and authoritative object upon which to fix its intense and demanding focus, dismissing the wide, shimmering horizon of comparative wisdom. The common memory, however, craving a decisive end, demanded a sudden, tragic cataclysm worthy of such monumental loss, and thus the popular imagination invented the myth of the singular, all-consuming fire that obliterated every scrap of wisdom in a single night of devastation. Though historians knew that the decay was far more gradual, a slow attrition caused by wars, civic neglect, budgetary cuts, and the insidious rot of time and worms, the simpler narrative of spectacular inferno proved far more compelling to the human heart. This manufactured tragedy offered a clean demarcation between a golden past and a shadowed present, conveniently exonerating the generations who had allowed the slow decline by blaming instead the instantaneous cruelty of flame or the indiscriminate violence of foreign invasion. It is demonstrably easier for the conscience of posterity to mourn the sudden, spectacular death of an ideal than to confront the tedious responsibility of sustaining it through generations of intellectual fatigue and political apathy. A later iteration of the Alexandrian holdings, the famed daughter library housed within the magnificent temple of the Serapeum, met a more definitive and publicly witnessed end, though its collection was already but a fraction of the Museon's former glory and was largely specialized or duplicated. When religious fervor surged across the city in the late 4th century, the physical structure of the Serapeum, housing both sacred statue and secular scroll, became a symbolic target for those who saw accumulated pagan wisdom as an obstruction to divine clarity and purity. The violent dismantling of this grand complex, often confused by subsequent ages with the demise of the original Ptolemaic library, represented the final, dramatic assertion that certain forms of open, critical inquiry were now deemed dangerous and subversive to the accepted order of the cosmos and the security of the soul. This destructive act marked the visible triumph of certainty over philosophy's enduring, unsettling questions, leaving monumental ruins where once stood the serene statues of the gods, the quiet tables of the scribes, and the ordered stacks of human endeavor. In the decades following the disappearance of the great collections, Alexandria entered a period of profound quietude, a silence that settled over the city like a fine dust of forgotten ink, distinct from the boisterous clamor of the market or the docks. The absence of the thousands of international scribes, thinkers, and wealthy patrons who had once sustained the massive intellectual engine created a palpable, invisible pressure, a vacuum where once had been the lively friction of incessant debate and comparative analysis of every known work. One could walk the porticos where once Eratosthenes had calculated the Earth's circumference or Euclid had taught his geometry to eager students, and feel only the cool indifference of the Mediterranean air and the faint, melancholic echo of vanished voices. This quietude was the ultimate evidence of the intellectual loss, the chilling realization that the great enterprise of global knowledge, the comprehensive collation of every written thought, had ceased to draw breath in its principal sanctuary. The economic impact of this decline rippled throughout the city's specialized crafts, affecting the papyrus merchants, who no longer supplied hundreds of thousands of fresh rolls annually, and the bookbinders whose skills in conservation and repair were increasingly unnecessary outside of small religious circles. Where once the entire port district had thrived on the international trade and knowledge, importing rare texts from India, Athens, and Rome, now the ships arrived bearing grain and spices, acknowledging the shift from intellectual capital to mere physical sustenance. The memory of the library became a source of civic pride mixed with deep, inexpressible shame, a historical burden carried by Alexandrians who knew their predecessors had once stood at the absolute pinnacle of human understanding, only to watch that height be abandoned for lower, more easily defended ground. The city learned the painful lesson that infrastructure designed for intellectual ambition requires constant feeding and protection, lest it simply starve and crumble under the pressure of simpler human needs. Yet, the scattered seeds of Alexandrian thought, carried westward to the burgeoning courts of Byzantium and eastward across the great Syrian plain and into Mesopotamia, soon found new and fertile ground in civilizations eager to absorb the distilled essence of Greek reason. Syriac scholars, working diligently in Edessa and Nisibis, translated profound works of medicine, astronomy, and mathematics from Greek into their own tongue, preserving the analytical rigor of Hippocrates and Galen, thereby preparing the intellectual pathway for a magnificent awakening centuries later in the Islamic world. This continuous, painstaking work of translation and transmission ensured that while the original physical collection of papyrus was irrevocably gone, the foundational texts, methodologies, and spirit of comprehensive inquiry were merely awaiting the next great flowering of human curiosity to be rediscovered and expanded. The intellectual flame was carefully shielded and carried forth by diligent hands, burning quietly in monastic cells and scholarly courts, patiently awaiting the hour when the Western world would again be ready to receive its light, and perhaps mourn the true magnitude of its self-imposed shadow. The Byzantine Empire, though inheriting the organizational structure and legal codes of Rome, also absorbed a significant portion of the philosophical heritage that had escaped Alexandria's fate, utilizing it primarily for administrative and theological fortification. Scholars in Constantinople maintained a narrow but deep focus on classical grammarians and certain crucial scientific texts, recognizing their utility in maintaining a cohesive and educated imperial bureaucracy, though they lacked the Musians' boundless, reckless appetite for collection and cross-referencing. They became curators of a smaller, safer canon focused on utility and orthodoxy rather than universal discovery, demonstrating that the preservation of knowledge is often less about curiosity and more about the practical necessities of political power. The sheer scope of Ptolemy's vision, encompassing every human thought regardless of its immediate usefulness or spiritual compatibility, was too vast, too wild for the sensibilities of the later, more cautious ages. The enduring significance of the library thus lies not just in the sheer volume of texts lost to history, but in the soaring ambition of the original endeavor. The Ptolemies had sought nothing less than a complete, unified comprehension of the known universe, a perfect mirror of human knowledge held within a single physical space under the sun. This aspiration, simultaneously magnificent and tragically impossible, speaks to the highest reaches of human yearning, the desire to escape fragmentation, to bring order to chaos, and to hold all truth within a single, authoritative grasp. The failure of the library to endure, therefore, serves as a perpetual philosophical commentary on the inherent impermanence of even the most formidable structures built by human hands against the erosive forces of time, politics, and the inevitable shifting tides of core belief. The ruins of the Mauseon, even in their ultimate dispersal and invisibility, whispered a warning to all subsequent generations who would attempt such grand projects, that the gathering of knowledge is not merely an architectural or cataloging feat, but a profound commitment requiring constant, collective intellectual vigilance against the slow poison of indifference. They revealed that the true enemy of understanding is rarely the sudden barbarian or the single zealous act of destruction, but the quiet moment when the inheritors of the legacy decide that the pursuit of difficult, comprehensive truth is simply no longer worth the enormous price of effort and defense. The scattered stones and shards of broken pottery became silent epitaphs for the notion that human beings can ever fully defeat the tendency towards specialization and fragmentation, even when they possess the capacity to see the whole world assembled on a single shelf. Ultimately, the library became less a physical place than a profound intellectual archetype, the unreachable summit of human potential, serving as a mythological standard against which all later attempts at academic collection and organization would be measured, and inevitably found wanting. Historians across centuries would lament its loss, using the Phantom Collection as proof of a golden age irrevocably severed from the present, fostering a sense of intellectual inferiority that spurred new searches and new collections across the Mediterranean and beyond. The ghost of Alexandria was a powerful motivator, driving monks in Ireland and scholars in Baghdad alike to undertake their own monumental tasks of preservation, fearful that the great darkness of forgetting might once again descend upon a complacent world. This ideal of universal knowledge, the belief that every differing opinion and every recorded scientific observation held intrinsic value worthy of preservation, was the most precious intellectual inheritance the library left behind, even in its absence. It was the recognition that the full truth could only be apprehended by considering the totality of human investigation, a concept fiercely difficult to maintain in eras dominated by singular religious or political orthodoxies demanding intellectual conformity. The very memory of the Mauseon thus became a silent argument for open inquiry, a perpetual reminder that the quest for comprehensive wisdom requires tolerating contradiction and absorbing complexity, tasks that the human spirit often finds too burdensome for long periods of time. The slow process of turning away from the vast secular wisdom, the careful excision of certain astronomical and medical texts deemed incompatible with new cosmology, demonstrated the painful selectivity of memory and preservation. Knowledge that did not serve the immediate political or spiritual needs of the ruling power was simply allowed to cease existing, not through formal decree, but through the mundane act of failing to copy and recopy aging scrolls. This quiet, bureaucratic selection process proved far more deadly to the intellectual diversity of the collection than any invading army, determining which voices of the past would survive to speak to the future and which would be condemned to permanent, undeserved silence, wrapped within the decaying linen of abandoned roles. Those dedicated few who still frequented the remnants of the Messian in its final, melancholic decades understood that they were participating in an elegy for an entire intellectual civilization, not merely observing the decay of a building. They saw the marble floors cracked by indifferent feet, and the dust settling on texts that had not been opened in generations, and recognized that the failure was primarily a failure of patronage and prioritization. It was a failure of the living to honor the ambition of the dead, a collective surrender to the notion that the maintenance of universal knowledge was too expensive, too dangerous, and ultimately too exhausting for minds preoccupied with immediate salvation and the fierce demands of day-to-day survival in an increasingly fragmented world. Even after the final structures associated with the great collections had crumbled entirely into the earth, their stones eventually repurposed for fortifications or lesser civic buildings, the phantom of the library continued to inform the geographic pride of Alexandria, maintaining the fiction of its intellectual primacy long into the Byzantine era. The city's identity remained inextricably linked to its forgotten past, often invoking the names of the great scholars of the Ptolemaic period in official rhetoric, even as the true spirit of critical inquiry they represented had long fled the city's narrowing streets. This reliance upon a mythical past to sustain a mediocre present is the final, sad commentary upon the collapse of the universal dream, where the memory of greatness becomes a substitute for the demanding reality of sustaining it. The true inheritors of the Alexandrian model, those who would later attempt the establishment of centralized libraries and academies that spanned the breadth of contemporary knowledge, studied the history of the Mausian not as a triumph, but as a cautionary tale detailing the vulnerabilities of concentrated intellectual power. They learned that securing wisdom meant diffusing it, translating it across linguistic barriers, and scattering its light across numerous centers, ensuring that no single calamity, whether military, political, or religious, could ever again extinguish the entire flame of global understanding. The loss of Alexandria taught the world the necessity of decentralization, forcing subsequent empires to adopt a more resilient, distributed model for knowledge preservation, realizing that survival lay in complexity and multiplicity rather than in solitary magnificence. And so, the legacy of the Great Library persisted less in tangible fragments than in the methodology it had perfected. The systematic cataloging, the rigorous textual criticism, the establishment of canons, and the very concept of the learned editor who could purify and organize the chaotic flood of accumulated human writing. These invisible instruments of scholarship, the mental apparatus inherited by subsequent generations of thinkers, proved to be the most enduring treasures salvaged from the wreckage of the Ptolemaic dream. They ensured that even when the original scrolls of Homer, Euclid, or Sappho were gone, the means to study and understand their essence, had it survived elsewhere, would forever bear the careful, rigorous imprint of Alexandrian method. It is through these filtered, second-hand sources, through the quotations embedded deep within Byzantine commentaries and the detailed translations found in the Eastern courts, that modern scholars still reconstruct the ghost of the magnificent collection, peering through the long curtain of history. The fragments speak of works that have utterly vanished, volumes on lost philosophies, exhaustive records of ancient monarchies, and mathematical treatises whose complexity has only been paralleled in the most recent centuries, all testifying to a period of intellectual density the world may never fully replicate. The study of the library's loss thus becomes not a story of emptiness, but a constant, tantalizing pursuit of the shadow of knowledge, an ongoing, mournful excavation into the bedrock of vanished truth. Yet the library did not perish in a single dramatic gasp swallowed whole by a sudden catastrophe, but rather underwent a protracted, agonizing dissolution, a slow fading of the light that stretched across 400 years of political neglect and cultural hostility. The initial great wound, the accidental burning of the harbor warehouses during Caesar's skirmishes, was but the first tremor. The true destruction came through the gradual erosion of the intellectual climate, the steady withdrawal of patronage, and the simple, ceaseless decay of the papyrus itself, which demands meticulous, costly renewal every few generations. As the Ptolemaic dynasty crumbled and Roman governance brought unstable rule, the stream of royal silver that once funded the copyists, the curators, and the purchasing agents dwindled to a trickle, leaving the vast holdings vulnerable to the very elements they were designed to defy: the damp sea air and the bookworms of indifference. The great engine of research, which required hundreds of dedicated scribes and editors working in unison to maintain and replicate its volatile holdings, began to sputter, losing both the financial means and the intellectual urgency that had driven its founding vision. Scholars of subsequent eras noted a palpable drop in the activity within the museum's halls by the 3rd century of the new era, remarking upon the silence where once there had been the clamor of rigorous debate and the incessant scratching of reeds upon parchment. The focus of learning shifted. Where once every known volume was sought and studied purely for its intrinsic merit, now a more practical, utilitarian approach dominated, preserving only those texts deemed necessary for administration, medicine, or the narrowly defined education of the elite. Thus, vast swaths of history, poetry, and esoteric philosophy, no longer deemed essential, slipped into the silent void, not destroyed by fire, but simply allowed to crumble into dust, unwrapped and unread. This gradual abandonment intensified dramatically with the shifting spiritual landscape of the empire, as the secular inquiries of Hellenic philosophy came into direct and often violent conflict with the newly dominant monotheistic faiths. The intellectual fervor that had revered geometry, astral observation, and the meticulous dissection of historical narrative began to be viewed with suspicion, often branded as impious curiosity or even dangerous sorcery by the zealous proponents of dogmatic truth. The Great Library itself and its sister institution, the Serapeum, the so-called daughter library, which held many of the overflow volumes and translations, became symbols of the fading pagan world, repositories of a defiant, pluralistic knowledge that refused to bow to a single, revealed authority. The tension between the pursuit of objective, measurable truth and the passionate assertion of divine certainty grew taut, threatening to snap the slender thread of ancient learning that still survived. It was in the year 391 of the Common Era that this tension reached its awful climax, when the Patriarch Theophilus of Alexandria, empowered by imperial decree and popular religious fervor, directed the destruction of the Serapeum, one of the most magnificent structures still standing in the city, holding a vast reservoir of the collection's surviving scrolls. The edifice, which was both a temple complex dedicated to the syncretic god Serapis and a revered center of scholarship, was utterly torn down, its statues smashed, and its irreplaceable scrolls, the detailed observations of Aristophanes, the subtle arguments of Neoplatonism, and the final remaining copies of works from the great Athenian tragic poets, were scattered, trampled, or deliberately burned as relics of idolatry. This was not the accidental destruction wrought by warfare, nor the passive decay of neglect, but a calculated, public assertion that there was knowledge which should not merely be forgotten, but actively purged from the memory of men. The few remaining scholars who had dedicated their lives to the ancient disciplines watched this obliteration with a horror that transcended mere physical loss, understanding that the very possibility of unfettered inquiry was being bricked up and buried beneath the rubble of the demolished temple. Many of these philosophers and mathematicians, seeing their life's work declared blasphemous and their existence precarious, chose immediate flight, scattering like seeds before a harsh wind, carrying with them only what scrolls they could physically secure and the unwritten knowledge within their own minds. They journeyed eastward to the Syriac centers of Edessa and Nisibis, and later still across the Persian border to the court of the Sassanid Shahs, finding temporary sanctuary in cities that valued the practical application of Greek medicine and astronomy, even if they rejected its theology. This diaspora ensured that the Alexandrian method, its precision in translation, its reverence for textual stability, and its commitment to organized scholarship was not entirely extinguished, but merely transplanted, allowing the sciences of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen to bloom anew in lands far removed from the Mediterranean Sea. The intellectual center of gravity shifted definitively eastward, establishing the foundation for what would eventually become the great flowering of Islamic scholarship centuries later, where the texts of Hellenic antiquity were diligently translated and preserved in Arabic, often saving them from total oblivion in the Latin West, which was descending into a period of intellectual isolation. The library thus found a strange, paradoxical immortality through its destruction, persisting as a silent, invisible influence upon those who came after, guiding their hands as they copied and commented upon the fragments that survived the purges. Yet, the original, vital essence of the collection, the sheer breadth of comparison, the ability to trace an argument through every permutation known to the classical world, the critical mass of contradictory evidence that fueled the museum's relentless self-correction, was irretrievably lost in the scattering. The surviving texts were now isolated islands, detached from the mainland of context that had given them their deepest meaning, understood by new readers who possessed neither the complete background material nor the unique, highly specialized language of the scholars who had created them. The vibrant, competitive intellectual ecosystem of the Ptolemaic era, where 100 theories contended in the same hall, was replaced by a series of fragmented traditions, each holding dear a specialized portion of the whole, mistaking the part for the magnificent, unified entirety. This long, tragic decline left Alexandria a shadow of its former intellectual self, a city still bearing the impressive, if crumbling, monuments of its past, but whose spirit of encyclopedic curiosity had been suffocated by the demands of orthodoxy. The final, infamous layer of the library's tragedy was woven much later, several centuries after the decline was complete and the main collection had vanished, culminating in the popular, yet historically controversial story concerning the arrival of the Arab armies in the 7th century. This narrative, arising long after the events it purported to describe, detailed a decisive moment where the last remaining books were supposedly condemned to flame by a conquering general, based upon the judgment that if they contradicted the sacred text, they were heretical, and if they agreed with it, they were superfluous. Whether this final, vast burning occurred precisely as recounted in later chronicles is a question that continues to occupy the minds of historians, who often find the evidence for such a grand, late destruction sparse and contradictory, arguing that the scrolls were largely gone by that time. But the persistence of the tale itself is perhaps more telling than its historical accuracy, functioning as a necessary, horrifying metaphor for the long, creeping process of abandonment and willful suppression that had truly consumed the library over generations. The myth of the final conflagration provides the human spirit with a singular villain and a definable moment of loss, lending narrative shape to a tragedy too diffuse and vast to be encompassed by the slow, bureaucratic suffocation of intellectual life and the ravages of climate and neglect. The enduring image of mountains of papyrus being fed into the public baths to fuel the fires for 6 long months serves to encapsulate the ultimate fate of all knowledge that lacks continuous care and fervent dedication, symbolizing the ease with which centuries of painstaking accumulation can be reduced to ash when the guardians of the flame turn their minds to other, more immediate concerns. It transforms the slow failure of political will and cultural unity into a stark, visceral symbol of intentional annihilation, fixing in the memory of mankind the profound and lasting shock of seeing the accumulated wisdom of the world treated as mere fuel, fit only to heat water and warm the bodies of the populace. This mythologized end, regardless of its factual basis, cements the library's position in the collective memory as the greatest testament to intellectual fragility, teaching the painful lesson that scrolls and codices, though containing the most profound truths, are merely brittle vessels vulnerable to the slightest shift in the cultural wind. It is through this lens of loss, the understanding that perfection is ephemeral and that knowledge must be fiercely and constantly defended against the tides of ignorance and zealotry, that the memory of the great Messian continues to haunt the world, a silent, subterranean stream of method and inquiry running beneath the noisy currents of history. And so, the legacy of Alexandria continues to be excavated not from physical ruins, for the true structure of the Museion remains elusive beneath the modern city's foundations, but from the careful reading of subsequent authors, the reconstruction of fragmented citations, and the philosophical contemplation of its foundational principles. The greatest treasure left to us is the idea of the library itself, the audacious, unwavering belief that all knowledge is interconnected, that skepticism is the engine of progress, and that the highest purpose of humanity is the systematic, ceaseless gathering and interrogation of every scrap of truth, regardless of its origin or its immediate utility. The physical scrolls may be lost to us, disintegrated by time or consumed by the flames of ideological conflict, but the ghostly architecture of the cataloging system, the very arrangement of human thought into genres, authors, and critical editions, survives within every subsequent effort to organize the expanding universe of texts. Every modern library, every university syllabus, every attempt to establish a canon of essential reading is an unconscious homage to the librarians who once walked the colonnades of the Museion, struggling against the entropic force of time to preserve the record of human endeavor. The final, silent scholars of Alexandria, those who carried their precious, brittle scrolls away into the Syrian desert, carried not just texts, but a promise, a commitment to the primacy of reasoned argument and measurable observation, ensuring that the light of inquiry, though dimming severely, never entirely perished. They knew that the true strength of the library lay not in the papyrus within its walls, but in the disciplined minds that interacted with those words, minds that could, in turn, recreate the essence of the learning even when the physical source was gone forever. The whispers of the lost works continue to reach us, echoing through the centuries and the margin notes of commentators, the careful summaries of Byzantine epitomes, and the soaring philosophical prologues written by Persian polymaths who had inherited the burden of Alexandrian preservation. These fragments describe astronomical calculations of impossible precision, lost works of comedy and tragedy that would redefine our understanding of the dramatic form, and historical accounts detailing kingdoms that have otherwise vanished entirely from the world's register, all silent testaments to the depth of the sea of learning that was allowed to dry up on the Egyptian shore. The very air of Alexandria today, though now thoroughly overlaid with the dust of new eras, seems to carry a faint, metallic scent of burnt papyrus and the residue of costly oils used to condition the ancient skins, a subliminal memory held captive in the soil of the ancient harbor. The silence of the city is not the silence of peace, but the quiet that follows a terrible, irrecoverable shouting, a profound intellectual trauma that still subtly shapes the ways in which we approach the study of the classical world, and the precarious nature of our own accumulated knowledge, urging vigilance against the forces that would prefer silence to complexity.